again, as discussed, the first thing I would point out is on the very first line there, beginning cash balance, we've tried to make a distinction between what was previously GAAP budgeted and what moving forward will be cash basis budget. You can see in the water fund that previously, if you looked at our budget, you would think that the water fund had a cash balance of $62.2 million. We now more accurately reflect that as 17.5. Moving to page 160.
I just, since you're starting to give us that illustration, I didn't know if anybody else had a question, but what you had stated previously is that's because other assets were included, so you might explain that as far as in that fund, it would have been buildings, it would have been other things, and that's why I thought you might kind of touch on that again.
Yes, thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Especially for those who are listening out and, you know, that watch this because I think you can't stress enough, we didn't lose all that cash. It's just how we're showing it on the books.
Indeed, and I certainly glossed over that. So diving into that a little bit, I can't give you an exact accounting of what was included in that $62 million number there. Certainly some of it was cash. Some of it was the booked value of the water plant, water lines, you know, all assets owned by the water fund itself. So, yeah, to your point, Deputy Mayor, that didn't go away. It's simply being reflected differently in the budget. It's still being accounted for the same. It's just reflected differently in the budget.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions?
Page 116, I think, also highlights a couple of the key differences that you'll see. I'm using the water fund as an example, but it applies equally to the wastewater and stormwater funds, as well as parking and fleet and some of those other internal services funds, IT. About halfway down the page, you'll see an $8.2 million expenditure. 57010. That line is capital outlay. That is essentially the number that the water department is spending on capital projects in 2015. And moving forward, we want to make sure that we're able to tie that number back to the CIP. And because I think that's also been an ongoing question for the governing body as to how those numbers tie back. You can see in 12, 13, and 14 it wasn't reflected in the budget. Doesn't mean we suddenly increased expenditures by $8.2 million. It just simply means, again, like a broken record, we're just reflecting them within the budget. A second major change that you'll see is the debt service principal payments. That $3.471 million line, just a couple lines down from that. Again, we've had debt service principal payments for a long time. It just hasn't been reflected within the budget. This appropriately changes that. And finally, 3 rows up from the bottom, line 58102, the infamous depreciation. In the 2014 budget, that was reflected as a $5.1 million expense. In the 2015 budget, it's reflected as a $0 expense. Again, depreciation doesn't cost us cash, so accurately reflected as such.
Does anybody have any comments or questions as we're moving along? Don't see any.
I would say that concludes that particular agenda item, so as long as there's no questions, we'll maybe circle back to page 114, which is the beginning of the water fund.
Yes, Mrs. Hiller.
A quick question related to all this. This will mean, with the switch from depreciation to actual expenditures and debt service, that we will feel a little more clearly in this budget the changes in our debt load, how much we've borrowed and therefore how much we have to pay was a little bit lost in depreciation, but we'll feel that much more directly as our expenditures directly or our borrowing goes up or goes down or we pay off debt, correct?
Councilmember Hill, if I understand your question, yes, we will be able to see that. That'll be more transparent, and it will be reflected within the budget as to those changes from year to year.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Harmon.
Thank you. Doug, on page 114, the very top line, the beginning cash balance for 2015 shows a budgeted figure of $17.5 million. Does that include revenue from the city ratepayers as well as water that we sell to outside the city to water districts?
Councilmember Harmon, yes, that both those numbers are included in that figure.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Did I see Mrs. Schwartz? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Doug, on page 119, and then in the stormwater fund, and also on page 116 with the water fund, there's bad debt expenses. One's $240,000 and the other one's $60,000. Can you explain what that is? Bad debt?
I don't know if Nicole Malott is behind me, but if she is, I may ask her to come up and walk through that.
She's smiling.
Hello. The bad debt expense is basically a certain amount of the revenue that we capture each year through service fees. Certain amount of it we won't collect. Unpaid water bills, people leaving, not paying their water bills. It's a certain amount of uncollectible revenue. I guess would be the best way to explain it.
And has this changed much from the previous year with the cash basis that we're going to?
No, it has not changed at all.
Okay. So we have $240,000 in the water fund and $60,000 in the stormwater fund that has not been collected, so to speak.
On average, that's what we see on an annual basis that is deemed uncollectible, and that's our accounts collectible that extend out over a year. After it's over a year old, we deem it as we're not going to be able to collect it.
Do you know if other cities have collections that they go after this? I mean, I know we do it in the court system and.
Yeah, we absolutely go after it, but there is just, I can't remember the number offhand that we send out to collections every year, but we collect probably, I don't know, 300,000 to $500,000 probably we do actually get through collections or through assessments for properties for unpaid.
So then we have another 300,000 that we don't collect.
Right,
Okay.
they're gone and we just can't find them.
Thank you.
Mrs. Hiller?
So with the switch to cash, are you still accruing the bills then? I mean, why would we still need a write-off?
That's a discussion that Nikki and I still need to have. It's one of those items that we haven't completely worked out at this point.
Did that answer your question, or does somebody want to? Mr. Gerber?
That's a great question. As we've circled back through this budget, I think there's a couple places where we still need to firm up where we've converted from cash to GAAP, and that's probably one of those, because to your point and to the point I've been making, we're not actually going to spend money on that.
Right.
That's not an expense, it's just simply revenue we won't collect.
Right.
That's correct.
So throughout that, those might be soft spots then if we leave them in the budget?
I'm not sure what you mean by soft spot, I'm sorry.
Well, if you are reflecting anticipated revenue that does not include that money because it's cash, that's what I'm hearing from you, then we would not do a write-off.
We would still be able to use accounting procedures to write it off of our books, essentially, and deem it uncollectible. It should not be reflected within the budget as an expenditure.
Correct. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you. Mr. Gerber? Treasurer, I think you can go continue on. I don't see any other questions.
Back on page 114, I think the one highlight I'd like to address, again specifically for the water fund, but for all three utility funds, is the fact that the 14 revenues are projected to be identical to the 15 revenues. That's deliberate. We did that by design. I think we all recognize that we're working with some infrastructure assets that need improvements and that need to be funded appropriately. And those are long-standing issues that we're trying to address while maintaining an appropriate balance between appropriate funding and our needs of infrastructure. I think we all anticipate that we need to have some sort of rate increase. We didn't want to presume anything in the budget, and so we left that flat by design. We would anticipate coming before you in the near term with some rate recommendations for your consideration.
Questions? Okay, I don't see any.
I would simply move then to the Stormwater Fund, which starts on 117. I'd make an identical comment that revenues are projected to be flat by design.
Does anybody have any other questions about the stormwater fund? Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'll step into this. So since in what you're saying, our expense total is larger than our revenue, and therefore, if there is no rate increase, we would have to have reductions in the expenses.
Mr. Mayor, the way the budget is set up now, if it's adopted as proposed, we would be eating into the cash balance.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, of course.
So you can see that we're projecting to spend 3.3 million more than we take in
Right.
revenue.
So that would be 3 million, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Mrs. Hiller?
This is probably a repeat of something you have said in earlier rate discussions, or others have, but now that we're looking at this in cash, are the reductions in cash balances reflected in this budget lower than we can go based on our requirements to keep certain amounts in our cash balances?
I think the way I'd like to answer that, Councilmember Hiller, is that we anticipate bringing forward some rate recommendations for you that will incorporate all those numbers and give you a more thorough analysis.
Thank you. Just backing up with the mayor.
Any other
Okay, that's
comments
good.
or questions? Okay.
Okay, I would move into then the wastewater fund.
And that's page 120.
I'm sorry, yes, page 120, thank you. So same book, chapter 3, revenues are anticipated to be flat by design. And the net result of that is we would anticipate spending 4.1 million more than we take in revenues for the 15 budget without any rate increases. The other point that I think is worth highlighting in the wastewater fund budget, as you know, we've just tried to give you a very big picture overview. In particular, the wastewater fund will be absorbing some additional employees. I think that was part of the Q&A that you received, and we've been discussing with you that between wastewater and stormwater, we'll be adding 8 full-time employees. And we can certainly get into questions on what those positions might do if you're so inclined. Mr. Sample is here, and I know he's anxious to come up and shed light on that, so if you have specific questions.
Are there questions?
I would like to hear it.
I think it would be.
You might want to.
Okay. Yeah, basically, we just don't have, for the amount of work we have, we don't have enough staff to complete that work. Now, WPC is responsible for the operations of the wastewater and the stormwater utility, and that includes a variety of different operations. 4 of those positions, which are equipment operators that you will see, would be on the collection side of WPC. Collection side of WPC means that the wastewater and stormwater collection system that collects the wastewater and the stormwater and moves it. The other 4 would be on the other side, which would be the plant and pump station operations section. Currently have a backlog of work orders that's growing. Just don't have enough staff to cover the hours of work.
Question, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, what would be some examples of those work orders? What type of work are we talking about that they would be doing?
Well, I'll take the plant and pump station side first. That would be, there's preventive work orders and corrective type work orders. Corrective type work orders are those types of work orders that are reactive. Something breaks down and you gotta go correct it. Examples of that would be clarifier or settling tank rehab, pump rebuild, belt press maintenance. Preventive type maintenance would be those things that we do monthly. There's 4,100 pieces of equipment that we maintain, not only monthly but also biannually, different times. But oil change, grease, adjustments. On the collection side, that collects the wastewater and the stormwater, 12,000 inlets in the city of Topeka. That would mean making sure that those are clear so that when we have a storm event, we don't have localized flooding. Cleaning of stormwater pipes underground. There's about 225 miles of that. Also making sure that any of the stormwater conveyance system is clear. You've got 225 miles of pipe underneath Topeka, but you also have about 500 miles of ditches that are really stormwater conveyance, part of the stormwater conveyance system that must be kept free. Those would be some examples.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. I know I certainly get calls about the ditches, as you call them, that aren't maintained or need help, and I know it takes time for someone to get out to clean out those waterway areas, and so I'm sure probably all of us have had those kind of calls. So I appreciate that explanation. And one question I have is, several years ago, the city had a reduction of staff. Was your department affected when that happened? Is this, at one time, did you have more employees that were handling some of these things?
Yes. With the 8 that I need, that would take us up to 73 on the wastewater side, 26 on the stormwater side, which would be 99. At one time, we had over 120 FTEs in the budget.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, because I want to make sure everybody understood that. I know I wasn't on the council at the time that happened, but I knew had been a reduction in force due to the recession and different things, and that has probably had a real impact on the ability to service things for people in the community. So I appreciate that, because it's still, you're under the level you were before. You're going to be under the levels that you were before that reduction in force.
Absolutely, and also over the last 10 years, the amount of infrastructure that we maintain has increased quite a bit too.
Okay.
Pump stations has increased by
Right.
10. The amount of miles of sewer line that we're responsible for is ever increasing.
All right. Are there other questions? Mrs. Hiller?
With this, I've tried to ask some questions like this a little earlier in the general fund budget process. With the addition of these employees, one of the things we know, and we as council people get the complaints more than familiarity with the routines, clean out that storm sewer inlet, a backup someplace. It's far cheaper to do that preventive maintenance and the routine servicing than to go out on an emergency call. So if we add these 8 positions, where would you be toward being able to do the routines that you see are needed on all this equipment and all this piping?
That's certainly where we want to get, to where we're doing more of the preventive maintenance, just like you described. This would it's not going to get us to where we need to be. I'll just be real honest with you. That keeps me as a manager on my toes. I've got to continue to find efficiencies. That's not a bad thing for an organization when a manager has to do that. It won't get us to where we need to be, but it will move us towards being more preventative with what we do.
If you were gonna look at a scale of 10, of 1 low, 10 high, where would you be today and where are you going with this 8? Where would you be at 6 and go to 8, or 4 and go to 6, or where?
Let's see. I'm not sure I quite understand.
On a
the
scale,
question.
absolutely out of control and exactly where you wanna be.
Oh, could I give you some opinions of numbers?
Mhm.
I would say, we're somewhere at that 60-some%
Okay.
minimum staffing level right now. This
Okay.
would move us up into that 70-some% range. As I said before, I think that, in my opinion, an organization should stay below the minimum staffing level because that keeps management continually looking for efficiencies.
Mr. Colson,
Appreciate
did you
that.
have comment?
So let's talk about process. Mr. Sample had an opportunity to go through our new process of how we approve new FTEs within this organization. We've set up probably 3 months back, 4 months back, we established a budget, finance, legal, operational team that whenever anybody has a desire to fill a position, whether it be Mr. Sample's FTEs that he's looking for, the chiefs have come forward, other departments have come forward, and you have to make a case. And we're probably at a 50-60% maybe approval rate on those, and it has to truly be justified. So while we understand that anybody can identify a need, we can't just automatically afford it. We need to make sure that every dollar that we spend, we view it as a strategic investment. There's going to be a specific return. If we don't, we will find ourselves in the same position that we were in before. And when you enter into a labor contract relationship with an employee, it's a whole lot more than just the wages. We've looked at benefits, we've looked at pension, we've looked at all those sort of things. We need to manage that, and we need to keep a consistent level of discipline in this regard forever. What we do is very difficult. And so when we come forward with that request, it's been thought out very thoroughly and vetted prior to it getting approved.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any follow-up or questions, comments?
I like that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
Yes, Mr.
I
Harmon.
have a question I'd like to ask Mr. Gerber. In each of these funds, we have, by water fund, I'm talking about the water fund, the stormwater fund, and the wastewater fund. We have a beginning cash balance and then an item for an ending cash balance. Are there any state law or federal law requirements that we retain a certain minimum of an ending cash balance, similar to what we do in the general fund?
Councilmember Harmon, the real concern with our ending cash balance comes into play when we go to issue revenue bonds. If we don't have an appropriate level of cash available, 30-day, 60-day, 90-day cash reserves, then our ratings are not as favorable as they should be.
Okay, okay, great, thank you. Deputy Mayor.
All right, any other questions? Proceed.
I will proceed into saying that concludes our presentation on the utility funds. And I would sit for questions.
Right.
Is there any overall questions with utilities? If not, we're moving to the next, that's right? Questions? Okay, I guess we're ready to move forward.
Item 7 here, this is where I wanted to be sure to address any of the other funds. What we've done is highlighted our major funds with a great majority of our expenditures and really focused on just the ones with the major changes. You all have in your budget book, we have 30 other funds that have budgets. And we've spelled out in the budget book what each of the funds, what the functions for. They all have pretty specific sources of revenue and sources of expenditures. We could definitely talk about any of those you'd like to talk about. We pulled out the ones that we felt like had major changes this year versus 14. One of the ones I wanted to talk about, because it's been a recurring issue, I think, with council meetings, but also one that's pretty important for us to talk about, is the Special Highway Motor Fuel Fund. And that's on page 103 in your budget books. So this is the fund that we take care of our streets. We use the motor fuel fund, and the source of this funding is a pass-through from both the state and the county that's been in existence in cities for many years. And the reason that it's become, I think, a talking point in the recent history has just been with the hearing about the state being in potential revenue difficulties. We always have to think about and be prepared for what we would do if we didn't get money that we had budgeted for from the state. So if you look at this fund summary for now assumes that we will be getting the revenues that we've been getting based on a similar formula from the state. We have been pretty conservative. We're given estimates from the county and from the League of Kansas Municipalities, and our numbers are even a little bit more conservative than theirs, just to be on the safe side. So as you can see here, even with these conservative assumptions, we would be spending more than we're making in this fund by about $765,000. So even if all of the money comes in from the state, and at this point it is for sure an unknown, just wanted to let you know that this is a fund that we're every year, as long as the revenues keep declining, but our expenditures keep increasing due to the cost of personnel and fixed costs like fuel, like commodities, we will be continuing to spend more than we're making out of this fund. We do have a cash balance at this point, but as you can see, that is declining to 15 to be projected to be just under $1 million. So on the revenue side, as I explained, major source of this revenue is the pass-through from the state and from the county. And then if you go down to the expenses, something that we wanted to highlight is that this expenditures, this is what the cost is to continue our current level of service. So overall, our expenditures in 15 are going up about $181,000. That's the cost of doing the current business. There's not necessarily an increased service in this fund. That's not reflecting something new specifically that we're doing. That's simply the cost to keep doing what we're currently doing. That's what it would cost us. So really, that's the driver towards the expenditure. Any of the increases that you see in 15 are related to really contractual costs, simply going up to continue to provide the current level of service.
Questions? Mr. Manspeaker.
I became aware last meeting that the jail crews are in the motor fuel tax, but I don't see where it's line item here.
Okay, so where it's line itemed, it's line itemed as what it says is inmate program revenue. So up in the revenues, it's probably a fourth of the way down the page. Do you see it there? And it looks a little bit different than the rest, and that's on purpose because we wanted this program to stand out. So what it is it's $357,000 in the 15, and then the expenditures are the very bottom line. So on page 105, So what that's doing is that's isolating the inmate program costs. And what this is that the inmate program is a program that we fund through our own departments. So any department that's benefiting from these services, and you all, the back page of the Q&A that you got lines out which departments are benefiting and how much each is contributing. Each of the departments contributes towards the cost of running these programs. And so it's not necessarily that the streets money or the streets fund is paying for this program. They do have a little bit because they do help them like with the brick crew. But actually the majority of these revenues and expenses are coming out of other departments. We simply fund it in the streets program because it's an area where it provides a certain amount of work. So no matter where you put it, it's in revenue neutral. The revenues equal the expenditures, so it's not adding to the expenditures of the streets fund.
Well, I mean, I guess my only concern with there's statutory requirements for what motor fuel funds can be spent on, is there not?
Yes, can only be spent on repair of streets.
Okay, and we're statutorily correct in paying for the jail crews out of that
As
fund?
long as they're working on the streets, yes.
But they're being reimbursed possibly for other work. Okay.
Correct.
And so that would lead me to another question, in that today I saw a jail crew working on the side of the highway, and there was a City of Topeka van, and my argument is that, yes, it's in the City of Topeka, but it's not City of Topeka property or technically our property to maintain, so why would we be paying crews to do work cleaning up the sides of the highway? And if we're being reimbursed, are we being reimbursed by the state for that cleanup?
We're gonna have Captain Scott come up, I believe.
Deputy Mayor, Councilman, and Speaker, that is actually what you were looking at is it wasn't the street crew, it was one of our other jail crews. What we did was we've partnered to help clean up the corridors, the entrances and exits to Topeka. And it's with Topeka Tree Care, and we have Shawnee County involved in that. We also have our Public Works Forestry, and we have the Topeka Tree Care folks with private partnerships. And what we do is the third Friday of every month since April, we've been going up and picking one corridor. And we work real diligently with Kansas Department of Transportation to pick that corridor, and they give us permission to do that, and we work with the Kansas Department of Transportation. So we've got about 5 different partners involved in this, and it's turned out to be a really good investment in our community.
Did you have a follow-up, Mr. Mann, Speaker?
Yeah, my only concern would be that many years ago, we used to pay people to clean up the side of the highway. We used to pay people to mow the side of the highway. The state cuts funding to those organizations, to those individuals that are doing that work, and now we're picking up that work. It's almost as if the state decided to quit doing their portion of the job, and now we've had to pick up, the city's had to pick up a portion of the job that the state should be taking care of.
Deputy Mayor, Councilman, and Speaker, this project, the gentleman who actually had started this was Lynn Holquist, and he actually approached the city about 2 years ago, and his whole goal and his mission and vision was that we bring the trees up to a level so that when the state does actually mow it, because they do actually do the mowing, they can get closer to the trees, they can do trim work without having to spend a lot of time, and give it a cleaner look, and also create better health of those areas where there's horticulture. So that was the mission and vision, and when we started working together back in, when it was reapproached at the end of 2013, then the city manager was involved, and we started working on this project, and we decided to go ahead and give it a go and see what it looks like. And this last was our third time going out on this particular project, and they spent about, I think they spent about 4 to 6 hours out there doing it in an area. And it's the third Friday of the month.
I saw him today.
Huh?
I saw him today. It's irrelevant. I mean, my point is that I don't want to see taxpayers, the citizens of Topeka, paying to maintain state roads when they're already hit tax-wise from the state to maintain state property. So now we're paying city tax to maintain state property. To me, that's a little bit of an issue. I'd rather see those jail crews in my neighborhood, in the parks, more specifically in the city of Topeka, rather than state property. I wouldn't want to see them cleaning up the Capitol, the State House grounds. That's somebody else's job. So I mean, I don't want to argue about it. I mean, and I think cleaning up the property is great, but my concern is, are we doing the state's work for them? That's all I'm asking.
Brad Reed, Deputy Mayor, Councilman Mansfield.
Yes.
Brad Reed just walked up, since you saw him today, those would be the highway crews, and they're actually paid for by the Department of Transportation that are out there.
In a van with the City of Topeka logo on the side of the door.
Yes. What they do is they fund it, for the base of the equipment and things like that. We put it together, and Rhonda Clemens coordinates the crews, and her salary, which she works for the City of Topeka, but her salary is actually reimbursed through the Kansas Department of Transportation. So that's how without those funds, her position would not exist.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to go back to the street maintenance for a minute and talk about, and maybe engage you in some conversation on that. And actually, you could say this is the Special Highway Fund with a budget next year of 1.6 million is really our street maintenance fund, correct? That's what we repair the streets, the potholes, all of that out of this fund.
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
And I know from the hearings we had in the public, we had 3 hearings on which people could vote for their areas of interest, those that most important. And as I have the figures here, street maintenance came out way ahead. By far, the citizens responded 398 for that out of 1,500. So almost like 1 in 5 is saying street maintenance is their highest priority. And we see, and it is going down because we're getting less funds, because cars are more efficient, et cetera. But my point is, and actually, and council members wise, this is something that at some point we may have to look at the possibility of providing additional funds other than just the motor fuel tax that we get from the state. And then my question is to the finance people, because you're now ours, but you had worked previously in other cities. To what extent are you aware of other cities putting additional funds into their street maintenance program in addition to just what they receive from the motor fuels tax? And that's putting you on the spot.
Mr. Mayor, I think both Mrs. Lee and I could answer that question from our experiences. One quick clarification, however, expenses are actually up in this fund.
All right.
From 6.3 to 6.5. The 1.6 number
I'm sorry,
represents
yes.
the beginning cash balance.
Thank you. Thank you for
Just
that
wanna make sure we're on
clarification.
the same page. In my experience, I think it's relatively typical for cities to provide other levels of support in addition to the motor fuel funds, whether it's in-kind stuff, such as paying for personnel, or whether it's direct contributions. That's probably more typical than not.
Is that typically from the general fund?
Mr. Mayor, I'd say typically yes.
Okay, thank you. So,
Any other comments or questions, Mr. Harmon?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'm looking in the budget book on pages 98, 99, and 100, which are the narrative of the various functions of the Public Works Department, broken down by funding source breakdown. As I look at this, I don't see any reference to snow removal. Where is that? Am I missing it?
yeah.
I'm probably missing it. Maybe Mr.
Mr.
Whitaker.
Whitaker is coming up.
Mr. Harmon, could you repeat your question? I'm not sure that everybody
Sure.
could hear it.
Sure, I'm sorry. I was looking on pages 98, 99, and 100 of the budget book, which provides a narrative of the functions of the Public Works Department and broken down by funding source in terms of what functions and being paid for by what source. So I looked through it, I don't see any reference to snow removal. So I just wondered, am I missing it, or is it in a different part of the budget book, or can you shed some light on that for me?
Deputy Mayor, Councilmember Harmon. snow removal expenses are within the motor fuel tax.
Okay.
And let me take you over to page 105. And about half, and really there are three components to snow removal, and that of course is labor, equipment, and then really the only material we use, if you look at about their number 54504, it says maintenance de-icer. That's all of our enhanced salt and everything that we, if you see that on page 105, it's about halfway down the page.
Yes.
That really is the only line item that you could really take back to snow removal because of the material. Other than that, it's labor, obviously the equipment operators, and then the equipment itself, which is covered in just the equipment expense. So, in addition to that, obviously, so within this budget, what we always had to do in the past, and let me say past, including this year, is we have to manage this budget based on what kind of snow we have. So if we have a light year, we have more, we spend less money, we can use more of the money of this budget towards other things for that year. So that is the street department's big, issue they have to deal with, is budgeting towards that snow, because obviously you can have it in the beginning of the year, and you got to plan for the end of the year and try to in between. What we've done this year, obviously, for 15, we've approved in the CIP that additional $1 million that is also street maintenance that will be used towards snow removal to help us implement that new snow removal, the enhanced snow removal plan that we want to put in place, where we're doing more plowing and getting out into our residential areas. And so that's how we will, subsidize that. Again, with that money, if we don't use it all, it's money that would be still used as street maintenance money. We can't, again, go use it somewhere else.
Yes, Mr.
Follow up, Your Honor. So I remember that. So is that $1 million, is that reflected on, in the special highway fund?
No, I do not.
Okay.
Councilmember Harmon, Deputy Mayor, that's reflected in the street sales tax, page 148.
Okay. Okay. Out of the citywide half-cent sales tax. That's where that million.
Specifically, that $15.5 million line item near the bottom of the page, it's contained within that number.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Your Honor. Appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, Mrs. Hiller.
Just if I could complete that line of questioning, then that clarifies some discussions we've had before. If we have to use it, you're using, if I'm following what you said, you're using it as sort of a reserve if we need it. You might or might not use the whole $1 million out of half-cent sales tax. If you do use it, will it be accounted for as a project then and moved over or itemized as a project?
Deputy Mayor, Councilmember Hiller, every snowstorm that we have, you've heard our city management system of City Works. Every snowstorm that we starts with a City Works ticket. And then we track every dollar, hour, equipment to that, because if it is a declared emergency by the governor, that's how we come up with our funds to be able, our dollars to know whether we can go back and get reimbursement, through an emergency issue. So we track all of those dollars for every snowstorm. At that point, I'd have to say, ask finance, maybe, how we would transfer it back, but we would be tracking every dollar based on those, those work orders for each storm.
I was concerned because I was wondering about that, whether it would just be, you've combined some of the other subsections of the half-cent sales tax as well, and whether they would still nonetheless be itemized project by project in terms of just being able to report it if needed.
Yes, and with the, let me say, it was contained within the curb gutter money. There's actually a purchase order whenever we start a contract. So there's a purchase order, so we track those dollars against that purchase order for curb and gutter. If we do alleys, we have, we track each of those, through either a work order or a purchase order.
Mhm. Any other questions? Are we ready to move on? I don't see any other questions. Moving on wherever you left off there.
So where I left off on the agenda was item 7B, and that was simply a holding place to give you all the opportunity to ask about any of the other funds. For the most part, the other funds would be anything in the back of the book that are under either other or long-term or miscellaneous.
Does anybody have any questions or need anything discussed on the other funds that weren't highlighted here today? Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question on page 158, the Neighborhood Revitalization Fund. And actually, I think it's important that, the citizens spoke on what are their highest priorities. And where street maintenance is so high, that's why I brought that up. I think if we have extra funds, maybe we should look at something like, how do we put some more money into those? Another one here, the neighborhood revitalization, we keep hearing over and over about doing more for the neighborhoods. And I'm not totally familiar with this fund, and it's the source, it's a rebate on property tax for improvements of their properties. And I assume probably we get about 150,000 in on that, and that's what is expended. Is that correct?
Mr. Fyan.
Deputy Mayor, yeah, let me try and back up and build to the answer. This money actually comes from our neighborhood revitalization program. There's an increment that, about 10 years or so ago, probably less than that, we did not give a full rebate back to the people that applied. We held some back. This is the money we held back, and it lasted for about 3 years, like 05 through 07, I think would be the years. So this keeps coming into the city, and there's actually I think the fund is projected to be around 300,000 or so, and when it all is said and done, that's roughly. So it will end in a couple years. We will stop getting this money from the county as that increment from a tax rebate that the property owner never got. It is written into the plan, the neighborhood revitalization plan for the city, that money can be spent on certain things. Namely, I believe, for instance, infill housing. Off the top of my head, I can remember infill housing and infrastructure to complete neighborhood revitalization projects. So that, basically, we're letting that fund accrue until we have a plan to come back and say, what should we use it on? Because it's finite. It'll stop in a couple years.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, and I was more curious because it's designated revitalization and for dilapidated structures, and I know the need is great out there. And this is one area where we could provide more for our neighborhoods to do the work they want to get done. But it's the type of fund it is. Maybe it's like we just let it go, and maybe we look at some way else to do more in that area.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have the exact language. It is very specific what you can use it on. I'm not sure this is the exact language that you're reading here is totally
Okay.
accurate. So what I would suggest is I will provide that exact language that's in the plan, and maybe we could put that in there.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions on other funds? Mr. Mayor, did you have any questions?
Sorry, I have one more. And that's perhaps Mr. Gerber. And where in the budget is the amount we set aside for demolishing structures? I know there's two funds. One is in HND, that they have some funds for voluntary demolishing. And then we hear every year that we don't have nearly enough to meet the demand for demolishing structures. And I was just curious is there a way, if that's out of general fund, that we could even put in another $25,000 or $50,000 that would be helpful to meet the need?
Mr. Mayor, I'll probably defer that question to Captain Scott, see if we can get him back up here and address that for you.
Deputy Mayor, could you repeat the question one more time so I make sure I understand it?
Every year, we have a list of structures that council approves to demolish. And we've already spent all of 2014, and we're halfway, I don't know, whatever, into 2015. There is not enough money to demolish the houses or structures that are health, safety reasons that we've approved the demolishing. And I'm just asking where that is, if we could add just a little bit more that would maybe allow us to do one more than we've done in the past. Again, that's another strong request from our neighborhoods, that we be more proactive in this area.
One of the things that we're looking at, we just sat down and had a meeting over demolitions. We've had several meetings over demolitions, working with H&D for the Voluntary Demolition Fund, as well as the general fund money that goes to demolitions. And we're trying to come up with new solutions to create more demolitions within the neighborhoods that need to be done. But the question is a good question, because currently we have an old school sitting on Van Buren, 1600 Southwest Van Buren. And what happened was the current owner bought it for like $1. And he had this grandiose idea of putting in a school there, and that fell through. And during the process of that falling through, the roof leaked, something terrible inside the building, and the floors have pancaked down on top of each other in that building. The reason I tell you this, you have some background on this particular building. And when we were trying to work with the owner to get this raised, during this process, people would get into the school, and then they cut away floor joists, which just caused more structural damage to it. Then we prepping it to see if we could get it to the point where we could bring it down. The asbestos, we had 12 inspections of asbestos, all came back positive. And that bumped what would originally been, if we didn't have asbestos, we were actually gonna be able to use the funds from what brought down the church, the rest of the church, because it burned, and we were able to put that money, roll that money into the next demo, which would have been that school. And that would have been under 50,000, would be 48,900. And what ended up happening, that bumped that demolition because of the asbestos quite a way up, around 219,000. So what we're trying to do is trying to come up with more ways so we can utilize the monies from H&D through voluntary demolitions, so that we can create enough money to bring down that one building. And then also hopefully come up with other funds afterwards that we can finish out our 2014 bids. And yes, more money would be a good thing if we could have it in there. I mean, as part of the bank account to finish off that. This particular demo is just, this doesn't come along very often. This is normally the average demolition out there is around anywhere from 15,000 in 12, like these 8,500 to the highest one here is $14,000 in residential demos, as long as we don't have any asbestos. And one of the things we're looking at is we're working on reworking a resolution for you, the council, to look at eventually to help out with that, and then just doing the funding differently so we can get more of these done.
Do you know how much general fund money goes into demolitions, or that's something you can get back to us on if we don't have that tonight? It's
Going off the past figures, not knowing that we had this big demolition with the asbestos issue, when we did the figures for the budget for code, we asked for 100,000, which was the same as last time. And then this came up 4 months after we put in the sheets. It came up 3 months later that had asbestos. But currently, we worked through the budget items on these. We have approximately, we actually in H&D right now, or code, we actually still have about $95,000 in that particular fund, simply because that's what we were working towards, is to get that school brought down. And we've been working through voluntary demolitions as much as possible to get those people. What happens is they like owe $600 on taxes. Well, they can't use H&E funds on a voluntary demo if they owe any tax money. So our job is to try to figure out how we can help them get past that point so that we can use these other funding, these H&E funds, to take care of the block grant funds.
Okay, well, but my point is not the H&D funds, I mean, because I know that's a set amount. I'm just thinking that if we could put even 25,000 more from the general fund into the general fund account for demolitions, but why don't we wait and see what the amount is, and then we can see if that, I mean, that could be brought up at the budget meeting in the council. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'd like to get you a more accurate answer on that before we proceed with that.
Deputy Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Harmon.
could you share that with the entire council? I'm interested in knowing that too. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Haven't seen it.
Deputy Mayor.
Mrs. Hiller.
I actually have a number of questions, but I'm not sure they're full council questions, so I'll be getting with Nikki before we have our final vote just to ask them, so.
Okay. Mrs. Swartz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before we actually take a vote on accepting the general fund budget, I know at the last year's budget meeting that was voted on by the council, which was a very late night, there was discussion that 74% of the budget went into public safety, and we haven't heard a lot about the public safety, the police and fire budgets. But can you tell me, will it be another 74% this next budget year? I mean, Nikki put together a really good description of the dollar and the breakdown, and 74% to public safety, 9% to infrastructure, 5% to recreation and leisure, courts and legal 5%, community development 2%, and city governance 2%, and internal services 3%. So is that breakdown with this budget, again, public safety is 74%, or is there a change in that figure?
I can provide you with that, in a follow-up document, I can provide you with that exact split out. What I can tell you in general, it's gonna be about the same number because the police department budget is relatively flat. The fire department budget, went up a little bit, but so did the whole city's general fund budget. So I'd anticipate it'd be about the same, but I'll follow up with the exact percentage.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions or comments? Do we want to take a break before we come back to sort of final? Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we can come back for final discussion.